Evermeres Justice. Washington, D.C., 1923. Rose Kensington woke to soft knocking at her door. When she peered outside, the street was empty. But on the doorstep lay a single rose, fresh and dewy. And in the distance, the faint scent of Captain Thomas Sinclair's cologne lingered in the night air. Chapter 1. The Rose and the Phantom Scent. The insistent tapping, a polite yet persistent rhythm against the mahogany, dragged Rose Kensington from the depths of a fitful sleep. It wasn't the jarring clang of the front bell, a sound that still, 5 years after the armistice, sent a shiver of dread down her spine, mirroring the gut-wrenching terror of telegrams arriving at all hours. This was softer, almost intimate, a sound that belonged more to a dream than to the stark reality of her Washington, D.C. townhouse. She slipped from the bed, the silk of her nightgown cool against her skin, a stark contrast to the sudden, inexplicable heat that prickled at the back of her neck. The grandfather clock in the hall chimed twice, the deep, sonorous tones echoing through the otherwise silent house. 2 a.m. Who would call at such an hour? Fear, a constant companion since Thomas's disappearance, tightened its grip. Pulling a velvet robe around her shoulders, she padded barefoot across the polished wooden floor to the front door. The house was filled with the scent of beeswax and lavender, a comforting aroma she cultivated to ward off the lingering ghosts of antiseptic and fear that sometimes clung to the edges of her memory, remnants of her time volunteering at Walter Reed. She peered through the peephole, her breath catching in her throat. The street outside was deserted. Gas lamps cast elongated, flickering shadows across the cobblestones, illuminating the empty porch. No carriages, no late-night revelers, no sign of anyone. Just the swirling tendrils of early morning mist, clinging to the wrought iron railings and obscuring the familiar outlines of her neighbors' houses. A wave of disappointment, sharp and unexpected, washed over her. She had, for a fleeting, foolish moment, hoped she unbolted the door, the heavy lock clicking loudly in the silence, and cautiously opened it. The cool night air rushed in, carrying with it the damp scent of the Potomac and something else, something almost imperceptible, yet undeniably familiar. It was a faint, fleeting fragrance, bay rum, pipe tobacco, and a hint of sandalwood. Captain Thomas Sinclair's cologne. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic bird trapped in a cage. It couldn't be. He was gone. The War Department had declared him missing in action, presumed dead, near Ypres in 1918. She had mourned him, grieved him, slowly and painfully pieced her life back together, brick by agonizing brick. Yet, there it was, that unmistakable scent, a ghost of a memory swirling in the night air. Her gaze fell to the doorstep. There, nestled amongst the swirling mist, lay a single, perfect red rose. Its petals were still tightly furled, its color a deep, velvety crimson that seemed to absorb the dim light. A single drop of dew clung to one petal, shimmering like a tear. It was a freedom rose, Thomas's favorite. He used to say its color reminded him of the courage of the men he served with, its thorns of the sacrifices they made. She picked it up, her fingers trembling. The stem was smooth and cool, the thorns surprisingly sharp. A tiny prick drew a bead of blood, a stark reminder of the pain that beauty could conceal. It was undeniably fresh, not a wilted bloom discarded from a passing admirer. Someone had placed it there, deliberately, recently. Rose scanned the street again, her eyes straining to pierce the darkness. The mist was thickening, blurring the edges of reality, making the familiar seem strange and unsettling. Was it a cruel joke? A misplaced gesture of sympathy from a well-meaning friend who knew her history with Thomas? Or could it be something more? The scent of his cologne, though fading, still lingered, a phantom touch that sent a shiver of both fear and a desperate, forbidden hope through her. She closed the door, leaning her back against it, the rose clutched tightly in her hand. Her mind raced, replaying every memory of Thomas, every whispered promise, every stolen kiss. The telegram she received had been so brief, so brutally impersonal. Regret to inform you Captain Thomas Sinclair missing in action presumed. The words had been seared into her memory, a constant ache in her heart. She had spent months clinging to the faint hope that he might be alive, a prisoner of war, perhaps, or suffering from amnesia. She had written countless letters to the War Department, to the Red Cross, to anyone who might have information. But the replies, when they came, were always the same. No trace, no record, no hope. Eventually, she had been forced to accept the agonizing truth. Thomas was gone. But now this rose, this scent. It was like a message from beyond the grave, a whisper in the darkness. Was it possible? Could he somehow, against all odds, have survived? Or was she simply losing her mind, grasping at straws, conjuring ghosts from the depths of her grief? She walked slowly back to her bedroom, the rose held carefully in her hand. The moonlight streamed through the window, illuminating the framed photograph on her nightstand. It was a picture of Thomas, taken shortly before he shipped out. He was smiling, his eyes crinkling at the corners, his hand resting on her shoulder. He looked so young, so full of life, so utterly unaware of the horrors that awaited him. She traced the outline of his face with her fingertip, her heart aching with a familiar pang of loss. "Thomas," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "Is it really you?" The only answer was the silence of the house, broken only by the distant rumble of a passing streetcar. The rose, still clutched in her hand, seemed to pulse with a life of its own, a silent testament to a love that refused to die. She knew, with a certainty that defied logic, that this was just the beginning. The knock at midnight, the rose, the phantom scent, they were all clues, fragments of a puzzle she was now compelled to solve. And she wouldn't rest until she found the truth, no matter how painful or how impossible it might be. The uncertainty, she decided, was a far heavier burden to carry than any truth that dawn, or her search, might reveal. Chapter 2. Whispers of Ypres. The dawn brought no answers, only a deepening sense of unease and a fragile, almost painful hope. Rose examined the rose again, turning it over in her hands. It was undeniably fresh, its petals still holding the dew of the night. She had placed it in a small vase on her bedside table, next to Thomas's photograph. The juxtaposition of the vibrant bloom and the faded image was a stark reminder of the passage of time, of life and loss, of a past that refused to stay buried. She dressed in a simple gray dress, a concession to the lingering societal expectations of widowhood, even though 5 years had passed. The black crepe she had worn for so long had felt like a suffocating shroud, a constant reminder of her grief. She had finally packed it away last year, a small act of defiance, a tentative step towards embracing life again. But the gray still felt like a compromise, a muted reflection of the vibrant woman she had once been. Downstairs, she made a pot of coffee, the strong aroma filling the kitchen, a familiar comfort in the unsettling atmosphere. She couldn't eat. Her stomach was twisted in knots, a mixture of anxiety and anticipation. She poured a cup and sat at the small kitchen table, staring out the window at the quiet street. The mist had dissipated, revealing the familiar cityscape, bathed in the soft morning light. Everything looked normal, yet nothing felt normal. She needed to talk to someone, to share this strange, unsettling experience. But who? Her friends, mostly society women preoccupied with teas and charity balls, wouldn't understand. They had offered their condolences, their polite platitudes, and then moved on with their lives. They wouldn't grasp the depth of her connection to Thomas, the unspoken bond that had transcended the horrors of war. There was only one person who might understand, who might even have answers. Mrs. Eleanor Davies, a former nurse who had served with Rose at Walter Reed. Eleanor was a woman of sharp intelligence and even sharper intuition, a woman who had seen the worst of war and yet retained a core of unwavering compassion. She had been a confidant during those dark days, a steady presence in a world of chaos and suffering. Rose finished her coffee, rinsed the cup, and made her decision. She would visit Eleanor. She grabbed her coat and hat and stepped out into the crisp morning air. The walk to Eleanor's small apartment near DuPont Circle was brisk, the exercise helping to calm her racing thoughts. She replayed the events of the night before, searching for any detail she might have missed, any clue that might shed light on the mystery. Eleanor's apartment was on the 3rd floor of a modest brownstone. Rose climbed the stairs, her heart pounding with a mixture of hope and trepidation. She knocked on the door, and after a moment it opened. Eleanor stood in the doorway, her gray hair pulled back in a neat bun, her eyes, as always, sharp and observant. She was wearing a simple house dress, her hands stained with ink. She spent her days now writing letters for veterans, helping them navigate the bureaucratic maze of the War Department. "Rose, my dear," Eleanor said, her voice warm and welcoming. "What a pleasant surprise."
Come in, come in.
Rose stepped inside, the familiar scent of lavender and old books filling the small, cluttered apartment. Eleanor's living room was a haven of tranquility, a stark contrast to the bustling city outside. Bookshelves lined the walls, overflowing with volumes on every subject imaginable. A small fireplace dominated one wall, a cheerful fire crackling merrily within. "I apologize for the early visit, Eleanor," Rose said, "but something strange happened last night." Eleanor gestured to a comfortable armchair near the fire. "Sit down, dear, and tell me all about it." Rose sat down, gratefully accepting the offer of warmth and companionship. She recounted the events of the previous night, the knock at the door, the empty street, the rose, and the unmistakable scent of Thomas's cologne. She spoke slowly, carefully, her voice trembling slightly. Eleanor listened intently, her expression unreadable. When Rose had finished, she remained silent for a moment, her brow furrowed in thought. "Ypres," she said finally, her voice low and thoughtful. "That's where they said he was lost." Rose nodded, her throat tight. The name of that small Belgian town, the site of some of the most horrific battles of the war, still sent a shiver of dread down her spine. "I remember," Eleanor continued, "there were whispers about men who were presumed dead, but who somehow survived. Shell shock, they called it. Some were found wandering the countryside, their minds shattered, their memories gone. Others simply disappeared." Rose's heart quickened. Do you think it's possible that Thomas?" Eleanor met her gaze, her eyes filled with a mixture of compassion and caution. "It's possible, Rose. It's a slim possibility, but it's possible. The war, it did strange things to men. It broke them, changed them, in ways we can't even begin to understand. But the War Department," Rose began, her voice trailing off. "The War Department," Eleanor interrupted, a hint of bitterness in her voice, "deals in numbers, in statistics. They don't see the individual men, the broken hearts, the shattered lives. They declared him dead, Rose, because it was easier that way. It closed the file, tied up the loose ends." A flicker of anger, a feeling she had suppressed for so long, ignited within Rose. She had always suspected that the War Department's investigation had been perfunctory, that they had been too quick to dismiss the possibility of Thomas's survival. "But if he is alive," Rose said, her voice trembling with a newfound determination, "where has he been all these years? Why hasn't he contacted me?" "That, my dear," Eleanor said, "is the question we need to answer. Perhaps he couldn't. Perhaps he didn't want to. The war, it changes a man. He might not be the same Thomas you remember." The thought sent a chill through Rose. The Thomas she knew was kind, compassionate, full of life and laughter. Could the horrors of war have transformed him into someone unrecognizable? "I have to find him, Eleanor," Rose said, her voice firm. "I have to know the truth, no matter how painful it might be." Eleanor nodded, her eyes filled with understanding. "I'll help you, Rose. I have contacts, people who might know something. We'll start by digging into the records, the casualty lists, the reports from Ypres. We'll leave no stone unturned." A surge of hope, stronger than anything she had felt in years, flooded through Rose. She wasn't alone. Eleanor was with her, and together, they would unravel the mystery of Captain Thomas Sinclair. The scent, she realized, the rose. It was a fragile thread of hope, but that thread was enough. It was a start. The whispers of Ypres, carried on the wind, were beginning to form a story, and she would hear it to its very end. Chapter 3. the telegram that never arrived. Eleanor, true to her word, was a force of nature. Within days, she had transformed her cozy living room into a makeshift war room, the walls plastered with maps of Belgium, casualty lists, and faded photographs of soldiers who had served in Thomas's regiment. She had contacted old friends from her nursing days, veterans organizations, and even a few shadowy figures who operated in the murky world of intelligence gathering. Rose spent every spare moment at Eleanor's apartment, poring over documents, following up leads, and clinging to the fragile hope that Thomas was still alive. The official War Department records were, as Eleanor had predicted, frustratingly unhelpful. They confirmed Thomas's assignment to the 316th Infantry Regiment, his deployment to France, and his subsequent disappearance near Ypres in October 1918. There was no mention of his body being recovered, no confirmation of his death. Just the chilling words, missing in action, presumed dead. But Eleanor had unearthed other documents, unofficial reports, eyewitness accounts, and rumors that painted a more complex picture. Several soldiers from Thomas's regiment, interviewed after the war, recalled seeing him on the morning of October 28th, the day he disappeared. He had been leading a patrol through a heavily shelled area, searching for a missing supply convoy. The last confirmed sighting was near a ruined farmhouse, just outside the village of Passchendaele. One soldier, a private first class named Samuel Miller, claimed to have seen Thomas moments before he vanished. He described Thomas as being shaken, but determined, his face covered in mud and grime, his eyes reflecting the horrors he had witnessed. Miller had urged Thomas to turn back, to seek shelter from the relentless shelling, but Thomas had refused, insisting that he had to find the missing convoy. Miller's account ended abruptly. He had been knocked unconscious by a nearby explosion and had woken up hours later in a field hospital, suffering from shell shock. He had never seen Thomas again. Rose read Miller's account over and over, her heart aching for the young, determined captain she had loved. She could almost picture him, standing there in the mud and the rain, his face streaked with grime, his eyes filled with a mixture of fear and unwavering resolve. "There's something else," Eleanor said, her voice drawing Rose back to the present. She was holding a small, tattered notebook, its pages filled with cramped, handwritten notes. This belonged to a sergeant major named Alastair Finch. He was a regimental clerk, responsible for keeping track of personnel and casualties. He died of influenza in 1919, but his widow kept his belongings. I managed to track her down. Eleanor opened the notebook and pointed to a specific entry. It was dated October 29, 1918, the day after Thomas's disappearance. The entry read, "Captain Sinclair reported MIA. Telegrams sent to family. Hold." Rose stared at the word hold, her mind racing. Why had the telegram been held? Had someone known something that the War Department didn't? Had there been a reason to believe that Thomas was still alive? "Finch's widow doesn't know anything about it," Eleanor said. She said her husband rarely spoke about his work. But she did find this tucked inside the notebook. Eleanor handed Rose a small, folded piece of paper. It was a draft of a telegram, written in Finch's handwriting. It was addressed to Rose, and it read, "Deepest regret to inform you Captain Thomas Sinclair killed in action Ypres October 28, 1918. But there was a line drawn through the words killed in action, and above it, in a different handwriting, was written the single word, unconfirmed. Rose felt a surge of adrenaline, a mixture of hope and fury. Someone had deliberately altered the telegram. Someone had known that Thomas's death was unconfirmed, yet they had allowed the War Department to declare him dead. Who wrote this? Rose asked, her voice trembling. Eleanor shook her head. I don't know. The handwriting is different from Finch's. It could be anyone, a superior officer, a medical officer, someone in intelligence. Rose stared at the altered telegram, her mind racing. This was a deliberate act of deception, a cover-up.
But why?
What was the reason for hiding the truth about Thomas's fate? We need to find out who wrote this, Rose said, her voice firm. And we need to find out why. Eleanor nodded. I agree. This changes everything. It means there's a possibility, a strong possibility, that Thomas was alive when this telegram was written. And if he was alive then, he might still be alive now. The hope that had been flickering within Rose now burst into a roaring flame. She wasn't chasing a ghost anymore. She was chasing a man who had been deliberately hidden, a man who might still be waiting to be found. The telegram that never arrived, the altered message, it was a betrayal, yes, but it was also a clue. A very important clue. The hold and the unconfirmed, those words were a lifeline, a whispered promise in the bureaucratic silence. And she would follow that promise, wherever it might lead. Chapter 4. A Widow's Black and a Soldier's Scars. The discovery of the altered telegram fueled Rose's determination, turning her grief into a burning resolve. She felt a renewed sense of purpose, a conviction that she was on the right track. The image of Thomas, lost and possibly suffering, spurred her on. She was no longer simply a grieving widow, she was an investigator, a seeker of truth. She and Eleanor spent the next few days meticulously examining Sergeant Major Finch's notebook, searching for any other clues, any hints about who might have altered the telegram. They scrutinized every entry, every name, every date, looking for patterns, anomalies, anything that might shed light on the mystery. They discovered that Finch had been a meticulous record keeper, documenting not only official casualties but also rumors, whispers, and unofficial reports. He had noted several instances of soldiers being wrongly reported as dead, only to reappear later, suffering from amnesia or shell shock. He had also made cryptic notes about Operation Nightingale, a clandestine intelligence operation that had been active in the Ypres sector. Operation Nightingale, Eleanor mused, tapping a finger against the notebook.
I've heard whispers about that.
It was a highly secretive operation involved in espionage, counterintelligence, and other things. Other things? Rose asked, her curiosity piqued. Eleanor hesitated. Let's just say they weren't always playing by the rules. They were known for their ruthlessness, their willingness to do whatever it took to achieve their objectives. Could Thomas have been involved in Operation Nightingale? It seemed unlikely. He was a line officer, a soldier, not a spy. But the war had blurred the lines between those roles, had forced men to do things they never would have imagined. Rose decided to shift her focus, to explore a different avenue of inquiry. She needed to talk to someone who had known Thomas, someone who had served with him in France. Someone who might have witnessed something, heard something, that could shed light on his disappearance. She remembered a conversation she had had with Thomas before he left, a conversation about a fellow officer, a Major Alastair Davies, no relation to Eleanor. Major Davies had been Thomas's commanding officer, a man he respected and admired. Thomas had described him as a tough, but fair leader, a man who cared deeply for his men. Rose decided to track down Major Davies. She knew it was a long shot. He might be dead, or he might simply refuse to talk to her.
But she had to try.
She spent days searching through military records, contacting veterans organizations, and making countless phone calls. Finally, she found him. Major Alastair Davies, retired, living on a small farm in Virginia. She wrote him a letter, explaining her situation, her quest to find the truth about Thomas's disappearance. She waited, anxiously, for a reply. Days turned into weeks, and she began to lose hope. Then one morning a letter arrived. It was from Major Davies. He had agreed to meet with her. The meeting was arranged for the following week. Rose traveled to Virginia by train, her heart pounding with a mixture of anticipation and dread. She arrived at the farm in the late afternoon, the setting sun casting long shadows across the rolling hills. Major Davies was waiting for her on the porch of his farmhouse. He was a tall, imposing figure, his hair now silver, his face weathered and lined, but his eyes still sharp and alert. He wore a worn tweed jacket and carried a walking stick. He greeted her with a curt nod, his expression unreadable. "Mrs. Kensington," he said, his voice gruff. "I received your letter. I must admit, I'm surprised to hear from you after all these years." "Thank you for agreeing to see me, Major," Rose said, her voice trembling slightly. "I know this is a difficult subject." He led her inside the farmhouse, to a small, sparsely furnished study. The room smelled of pipe tobacco and old leather. He gestured to a chair, and she sat down. "I remember Thomas Sinclair," Davies said, settling into a worn leather armchair opposite her. He was a good officer. Brave, dedicated, loyal. I was saddened to hear of his disappearance. Rose took a deep breath. Major Davies, she said, I believe Thomas may still be alive. Davies's eyebrows rose slightly, but he said nothing. Rose recounted the events of the past few weeks, the knock at the door, the rose, the scent of Thomas's cologne, the discovery of the altered telegram. She spoke passionately, her voice filled with a mixture of hope and desperation. Davies listened intently, his expression unchanged. When she had finished, he remained silent for a long moment, his gaze fixed on a distant point on the wall. Mrs. Kensington, he said finally, his voice low and measured, I understand your grief, your desire to find answers. But I must tell you, the war, it was a brutal, chaotic affair. Many men disappeared, their fates unknown. It's possible that Captain Sinclair simply vanished, that he was killed, and his body was never recovered. But the telegram, Rose insisted, the word unconfirmed. Someone knew something major. Someone deliberately withheld information. Davies sighed, running a hand through his silver hair. That telegram, it was a mistake. A clerical error. Sergeant Major Finch was a good man, but he was overwhelmed. The sheer volume of casualties, it was staggering. Mistakes were made. Rose felt a surge of frustration. He was dismissing her evidence, her intuition, her hope. But the scent, Major, she persisted. The rose. It was Thomas's favorite. It was his signature. Davies looked at her, his eyes filled with a mixture of pity and something else. Something she couldn't quite decipher. Mrs. Kensington, he said, his voice softening slightly, you need to let go. You need to move on with your life. Thomas is gone. He's not coming back. His words hit her like a physical blow. She felt the tears welling up in her eyes, the familiar ache of grief returning with a vengeance. I can't, she whispered, her voice choked with emotion. I have to know the truth. Davies stood up, his tall frame towering over her. The truth, Mrs. Kensington, he said, his voice hardening again, is that war is hell. It destroys everything it touches. It leaves behind nothing but scars and broken hearts. And sometimes the kindest thing we can do is to let the dead rest in peace. He turned and walked towards the door, his back to her. Rose felt a sudden, inexplicable chill. She had the distinct feeling that he was hiding something, that he knew more than he was letting on. The soldier's scars, she realized, were not just on his body. They were etched into his soul, and they were keeping him silent. The widow's black she wore was a symbol of mourning, yes, but his silence, his carefully chosen words. They were a heavier shroud. And she knew, with a sinking heart, that she wouldn't find the answer she sought from him. The meeting, which she had hoped would bring light, only deepened the shadows. Chapter 5. The Society Ball and the Unexpected Guest. Rose returned to Washington, defeated and disheartened. Major Davies's words echoed in her mind, a constant reminder of the obstacles she faced. He had been so adamant, so dismissive, that she began to doubt herself, to question whether she was chasing a phantom, a figment of her grief-stricken imagination. But the rose, the scent, the altered telegram, they were real. She couldn't dismiss them, couldn't simply accept the official narrative. She had to keep searching, keep digging, even if it meant facing more disappointment, more resistance. She threw herself back into her work with Eleanor, poring over documents, contacting more veterans, and following up every lead, no matter how tenuous. But the investigations seemed to have stalled. They had hit a dead end. In an attempt to distract herself from her worries, and perhaps to gather information in a less direct way, Rose decided to attend a society ball, a lavish affair hosted by Senator and Mrs. Harrison, prominent figures in Washington's political and social circles. She hadn't been to a social event in years, preferring the quiet solitude of her home to the superficial chatter and empty rituals of high society. But she knew that the ball would be attended by many influential people, including military officials, diplomats, and even a few intelligence officers. It was a chance, a slim chance, to gather information, to hear whispers, to perhaps uncover a clue that might lead her to Thomas. She chose a gown of deep midnight blue, a color that was both elegant and understated. It was a far cry from the black crepe she had worn for so long, but it still felt like a shield, a way to protect herself from the prying eyes and judgmental whispers of society. The ball was held in the grand ballroom of the Harrisons' mansion, a magnificent space filled with glittering chandeliers, ornate furniture, and the swirling colors of expensive gowns and tailored suits. The air was thick with the scent of perfume, cigar smoke, and the murmur of conversation. Rose felt out of place, a ghost in a world of vibrant life. She circulated through the crowd, exchanging polite greetings with acquaintances, her eyes constantly scanning the faces, searching for someone who might know something, anything about Thomas. She found herself in conversation with a group of military officers, their chests adorned with medals, their faces reflecting years of service and, perhaps, a hint of world weariness. She steered the conversation towards the war, towards Ypres, towards Operation Nightingale, carefully probing for information without revealing her true purpose. But the officers were guarded, their answers evasive. They spoke in generalities, avoiding specifics, their eyes betraying a hint of suspicion. They were clearly not going to reveal anything of substance to a civilian, especially a woman. Disappointed, Rose excused herself and moved on, her hope dwindling with each passing hour. She was about to give up, to retreat back to the safety of her solitude, when she saw him. He was standing across the room, near a group of diplomats, engaged in conversation. He was tall, his hair dark and slightly graying at the temples, his face familiar. It was a face she had seen before, a face that had haunted her dreams for years. Her heart stopped. She felt a wave of dizziness, a sense of unreality.
It couldn't be.
It was impossible. But it was him. He was wearing a tailored suit, not a military uniform, but there was no mistaking the way he stood, the way he held his head, the intensity of his gaze. It was Thomas. He hadn't aged much. A few more lines around his eyes, a hint of weariness in his expression, but it was undeniably him. He looked different somehow. More guarded, more reserved, his eyes reflecting a depth of experience that she couldn't fathom. She stood there, frozen, unable to move, unable to speak. Her mind raced, struggling to comprehend what she was seeing. Was it a hallucination? A cruel trick of the light? Or was it really him? He turned his head, his gaze sweeping across the room. And then his eyes met hers. For a moment, time seemed to stand still. The noise of the ball faded into the background, the swirling colors blurred, the scent of perfume and cigar smoke vanished. There was only him and her, and the unspoken connection that spanned the years, the distance, the impossible. He didn't smile. His expression remained unchanged, but she saw a flicker of recognition in his eyes, a hint of something else. Something she couldn't quite define. Was it fear?
Surprise?
Regret? He took a step towards her, and then, abruptly, he stopped. He glanced around the room, his eyes darting from face to face, as if searching for someone or something. Then he turned and walked away, disappearing into the crowd. Rose stood there, stunned, her heart pounding, her mind reeling. It had been him. She was sure of it. But why had he walked away? Why hadn't he spoken to her? What was he doing here, at a society ball, after all these years? The unexpected guest had appeared and vanished, leaving behind a whirlwind of confusion and a renewed, desperate hope. He was alive. That much was certain. But the circumstances, they were more mysterious than ever. She had seen him, but now, she felt further away from him than ever before. Chapter 6. Dance of Shadows and Half-Truths. The encounter, brief and bewildering as it was, left Rose shaken but resolute. Seeing Thomas, even for those fleeting moments, had reignited the fire within her. The doubt that had crept in after her meeting with Major Davies was swept away by the undeniable reality of his presence. He was alive and he was here in Washington. But he was also a different man, a man shrouded in mystery, a man who, for reasons she couldn't comprehend, had chosen to remain hidden. She left the ball immediately, her mind racing, her heart pounding with a mixture of excitement and trepidation. She hailed a cab and returned to her townhouse. The image of Thomas's face, his eyes, his fleeting glance, burned into her memory. She couldn't sleep. She paced the floor, replaying the encounter over and over, trying to decipher his expression, his reaction, his abrupt departure. Why hadn't he spoken to her? Why had he walked away? Was he in danger? Was he involved in something clandestine? The next morning, she went straight to Eleanor's apartment, her mind buzzing with questions. Eleanor listened intently, her eyes widening as Rose described the encounter. He was there, Rose insisted, her voice trembling with emotion. It was him, Eleanor. I'm sure of it. Eleanor nodded, her expression thoughtful. It's extraordinary, Rose. But it also raises more questions than it answers. Why is he here? Why hasn't he contacted you? What has he been doing all these years? I don't know, Rose said, her voice filled with frustration. But I have to find out. I have to talk to him. They spent the day brainstorming, trying to figure out Thomas's possible whereabouts, his reasons for remaining hidden. They revisited the information they had gathered about Operation Nightingale, the secretive intelligence operation that had been active in the Ypres sector. Could Thomas have been recruited into that operation? Could his disappearance have been staged, a cover for some clandestine mission? It's possible, Eleanor said. The fact that he was at the society ball, mingling with diplomats and intelligence officers, it suggests that he's still involved in that world, in some capacity. They decided to focus their efforts on identifying the people Thomas had been talking to at the ball. They reviewed the guest list, cross-referencing it with their files on known intelligence operatives and government officials. It was a painstaking process, but they were determined to uncover any connection, any clue that might lead them to Thomas. As they worked, Rose couldn't shake the feeling that she was being watched, that someone was aware of her investigation. She had noticed a dark sedan parked across the street from her townhouse several times in the past few days. She had dismissed it as coincidence, but now, she wasn't so sure. Eleanor, she said, her voice low, I think someone is following me. Eleanor looked up, her expression concerned. Are you sure? Rose nodded. I've seen the same car, a black Ford, several times. It's always parked at a distance, but I have a sense that I'm being observed. Eleanor's eyes narrowed. This could be dangerous, Rose. If Thomas is involved in something clandestine, his associates might be ruthless. They might try to stop you from finding him. Rose felt a chill run down her spine. She hadn't considered the possibility that her search for Thomas might put her in danger. But she wasn't afraid. She was determined to find him, no matter the cost. I won't be deterred, she said, her voice firm. I have to find him, Eleanor. I have to know the truth. Eleanor nodded, her eyes filled with admiration. I know you will, Rose. And I'll be with you every step of the way. They continued their investigation, working late into the night, fueled by coffee and a shared determination. They discovered that one of the men Thomas had been talking to at the ball was a high-ranking official in the State Department, a man named Arthur Caldwell. Caldwell was known for his close ties to the intelligence community, and he had a reputation for being discreet. Caldwell, Eleanor mused. He's a powerful man, Rose. He could be the key to finding Thomas. Rose agreed. She decided to try to contact Caldwell, to arrange a meeting. It was a risky move, but she felt she had no other choice. She was dancing in a world of shadows and half-truths, and she was determined to bring the secrets into the light. The brief encounter at the ball, the way he'd looked at her and then melted away, it was a dance of its own. A dance she was now determined to join, even if it meant stepping into danger. She had to know why he'd left, why he stayed away, and why he'd reappeared now. The answers, she suspected, were tangled in a web far more complex than she could have ever imagined. Chapter 7. The Captain's Lost Letters. Rose's attempt to contact Arthur Caldwell proved more difficult than she anticipated. He was a busy man, shielded by layers of bureaucracy and a reputation for being inaccessible. Her phone calls were met with polite refusals, her letters ignored. She began to feel as though she was chasing a ghost, a man who existed only in the shadows. But she refused to give up. She knew that Caldwell was the key to finding Thomas, the link between the society ball and the world of espionage that Thomas seemed to inhabit. She decided to try a different approach. She remembered that Caldwell was a regular attendee at the weekly lectures held at the Smithsonian Institution, specifically those focusing on history and international affairs. She decided to attend the next lecture, hoping to corner him, to force a conversation. She arrived at the Smithsonian early, securing a seat near the front of the auditorium. The lecture was on the intricacies of post-war diplomacy, a topic that was both relevant to her search and genuinely interesting. She listened intently, taking notes, her eyes constantly scanning the room, searching for Caldwell. He arrived just as the lecture was about to begin, accompanied by two other men, both of whom looked like they belonged in the shadowy world of intelligence. He took a seat in the row behind Rose, his presence sending a shiver of anticipation through her. During the intermission, Rose approached him. She introduced herself, mentioning her late husband, Captain Thomas Sinclair, and her interest in the history of the Great War. Caldwell was polite but guarded, his eyes betraying a hint of suspicion. "Mr. Caldwell," Rose said, her voice steady despite the tremor in her hands, "I believe you may have known my husband. He was involved in certain operations during the war." Caldwell's expression remained unchanged. "Mrs. Kensington," he said, his voice smooth and diplomatic, "I meet many people in my line of work. I'm afraid I don't recall your husband." Rose wasn't deterred. "I saw you talking to him at the Harrisons' ball," she persisted. He looked very familiar. Caldwell's eyes narrowed slightly. "I attend many social events, Mrs. Kensington." "I'm sure you're mistaken." Rose knew he was lying. She could see it in his eyes, in the subtle shift in his body language. He knew Thomas, and he knew more than he was letting on. "Mr. Caldwell," she said, her voice hardening, "I'm not going to give up. I know my husband is alive, and I believe you know where he is. I'm asking you, please help me find him." Caldwell looked at her for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Then he sighed, a hint of resignation in his voice. "Mrs. Kensington," he said, his voice low, "you're playing with fire. You don't understand the complexities of the situation. Some things are best left buried." "My husband is not a thing to be buried, Mr. Caldwell," Rose retorted, her voice filled with anger. "He's a man, a soldier, a husband. And I deserve to know the truth." Caldwell hesitated, then he reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, sealed envelope. "This is for you," he said, handing it to her. "Don't open it until you get home. And be careful, Mrs. Kensington. You're walking into a dangerous world." He turned and walked away, leaving Rose standing there, stunned, the envelope clutched tightly in her hand. She watched him go, her mind racing, her heart pounding with a mixture of anticipation and dread. She returned to her townhouse, her hands trembling as she opened the envelope. Inside, there was a single sheet of paper and a small, worn leather-bound book. The paper contained a handwritten note, and signed, with a single address in Georgetown and a time. Tomorrow, 10 a.m. The leather-bound book, it was a collection of letters. Letters written by Thomas. Rose recognized his handwriting immediately, the familiar slant, the distinctive loops and swirls. Her heart ached as she read the first letter, dated September 1918, just weeks before his disappearance. The letters were addressed to her, filled with his love, his hopes, his fears. He described the horrors of the war, the relentless shelling, the constant fear, the loss of his comrades. But he also wrote about his unwavering belief in her, in their love, in the future they would have together. As she read through the letters, she realized that they stopped abruptly in mid-October 1918. There were no letters from the last few weeks of his service, the weeks leading up to his disappearance. And then she found it, tucked between the pages of the last letter. There was a small, folded piece of paper. It was a map, a hand-drawn map of the Ypres sector, with a specific location marked with an X. The location was near the ruined farmhouse, where Thomas had last been seen. Rose stared at the map, her mind racing. The letters, the map, they were clues, pieces of a puzzle that was slowly coming together. The address in Georgetown, the meeting tomorrow, it was all connected. Thomas had left her a trail, a way to find him. The captain's lost letters, she realized, were not lost at all. They'd been deliberately held, deliberately delivered now. And the map, it was a message from the past, a guide to the present, and a promise of a future she was now determined to reclaim. Chapter 8. A meeting in the Smithsonian. The address in Georgetown led Rose to a small, unassuming antique shop, tucked away on a quiet side street. The shop was filled with the scent of old wood, beeswax, and the faint aroma of dust, a comforting smell that reminded her of her childhood home. The windows were cluttered with a jumble of artifacts, antique furniture, porcelain dolls, faded paintings, and dusty books. She arrived a few minutes before 10, her heart pounding with a mixture of anticipation and nervousness. She had spent the night reading and rereading Thomas's letters, her heart aching with a mixture of joy and sorrow. The letters were a tangible link to the man she had loved, a reminder of the life they had shared, the dreams they had cherished. But they also served as a stark reminder of the time they had lost, the years that had been stolen from them. She browsed the shop, pretending to be interested in the antiques, her eyes constantly scanning the room, searching for any sign of anyone. The shopkeeper, an elderly woman with a kind face and twinkling eyes, greeted her politely but didn't engage in conversation. At precisely 10 o'clock, a man entered the shop. He was tall, his hair dark and neatly combed, his face unfamiliar. He was wearing a well-tailored suit, his expression serious and guarded. He approached Rose, his eyes meeting hers. "Mrs. Kensington?" he asked, his voice low and polite. Rose nodded, her heart skipping a beat.
"Yes."
"I believe you have something for me," he said, his gaze flickering towards the small leather-bound book she was carrying. Rose hesitated. She had been instructed to bring the book, but she was reluctant to part with it. It was a precious link to Thomas, a tangible piece of her past.
"Who are you?"
she asked, her voice trembling slightly. "And how do you know about this?" The man smiled, a fleeting, almost imperceptible smile. "Let's just say I'm a friend of Captain Sinclair's. He asked me to retrieve this for him." Rose's eyes narrowed. "If you're a friend of his, then tell me, where is he?" The man's smile vanished. "I'm afraid I can't answer that, Mrs. Kensington. I'm simply here to collect the book." Rose felt a surge of frustration. She was so close to finding Thomas, yet he remained just out of reach, shrouded in mystery. "I won't give you the book," she said, her voice firm, "until you tell me something about him. Is he safe?" The man sighed, running a hand through his hair. "He's alive, Mrs. Kensington. That's all I can tell you." Rose's heart leaped with a mixture of relief and renewed determination. He was alive. That was all that mattered. "Please," she said, her voice pleading, "can I see him?
"Can I talk to him?"
The man hesitated. "That's not possible, Mrs. Kensington. Not yet."
"But why?"
Rose insisted. "Why is he hiding? What is going on?" The man looked at her, his eyes filled with a mixture of compassion and warning. "Mrs. Kensington," he said, his voice low, "you need to understand Captain Sinclair is involved in something delicate. Something that requires discretion." "I don't care," Rose said, her voice rising. "I deserve to know the truth. I've waited 5 years. I've grieved him. I've rebuilt my life. And now, I find out he's alive, and you're telling me I can't see him? It's not fair." The man looked around the shop, as if checking to see if they were being overheard. Then, he leaned closer to Rose, his voice barely a whisper.
"There's a meeting," he said.
"Tomorrow, at the Smithsonian. The Natural History Museum, the Hall of Gems.
Noon. Be there.
And be discreet." He turned and walked away, disappearing out the door before Rose could respond. She stood there, stunned, her mind racing. The Smithsonian, again. It seemed to be a recurring theme, a place of secrets and clandestine meetings. She clutched the leather-bound book to her chest, her heart pounding with anticipation. Tomorrow, at noon, she would finally see him. She would finally have answers. She would finally know the truth. But a sense of unease lingered. The man's warning, his guarded words, the secrecy surrounding Thomas, it all pointed to something dangerous, something that could put both of them at risk. She had a feeling that this meeting, this reunion, would be far more complicated than she had ever imagined. The antique shop, with its silent artifacts and hidden histories, felt like a prelude to a much larger, much more dangerous game. Chapter 9. The Secret of Arlington Cemetery. Rose spent a restless night, her mind filled with a whirlwind of emotions: anticipation, excitement, fear, and a lingering sense of unease. The meeting at the Smithsonian was looming, a beacon of hope in a sea of uncertainty. She had waited 5 years for this moment, 5 years of grief, of unanswered questions, of a life lived in limbo. And now, finally, she was about to see Thomas again. But the secrecy surrounding his reappearance, the warnings from both Caldwell and the mysterious man in the antique shop, cast a shadow over her anticipation. She couldn't shake the feeling that she was walking into a dangerous situation, that Thomas was involved in something far more complex, far more perilous, than she could have ever imagined. She arrived at the Smithsonian's Natural History Museum early, her heart pounding with a mixture of excitement and trepidation. The Hall of Gems was a magnificent space, filled with glittering displays of precious stones, their colors shimmering under the soft lighting. It was a place of beauty, of wonder, a stark contrast to the shadowy world of espionage that Thomas seemed to inhabit. She wandered through the hall, pretending to be interested in the exhibits, her eyes constantly scanning the room, searching for any sign of him. The hall was crowded with visitors, their voices a low murmur that blended with the soft music playing in the background. She found a bench near the Hope Diamond, a legendary gem with a history of curses and intrigue, and sat down to wait. The minutes ticked by slowly, each one an eternity. She felt a knot of anxiety tightening in her stomach. What if he didn't come? What if this was all a cruel hoax, a figment of her desperate imagination? And then she saw him. He was standing across the room, near a display of emeralds, his back to her. He was wearing a gray suit, his hair slightly longer than she remembered, his posture familiar. It was him. She stood up, her legs trembling slightly, and started to walk towards him. But before she could reach him, a hand grabbed her arm. She turned, startled, and found herself face to face with a man she didn't recognize. He was tall, with a stern face and cold, calculating eyes. He was wearing a dark suit, his hand gripping her arm with surprising strength. "Mrs. Kensington," he said, his voice low and menacing, "I believe you have something that belongs to us." Rose's heart sank. She knew instantly that this was not a friend, not an ally. This was someone who wanted to stop her from seeing Thomas, someone who represented the forces that had kept him hidden for so long. I don't know what you're talking about," she stammered, trying to pull her arm free. The man's grip tightened. "The map, Mrs. Kensington. The map that Captain Sinclair sent you." Rose's mind raced. How did he know about the map? Had she been followed? Had her townhouse been searched? I don't have it," she lied, her voice trembling. The man smiled, a cold, cruel smile. "Don't play games with me, Mrs. Kensington. We know you have it, and we're prepared to do whatever it takes to get it back." He pulled her towards a side exit, his grip unrelenting. Rose struggled, trying to break free, but he was too strong. She looked around the hall, desperately searching for Thomas, but he was gone. He had vanished, as quickly and mysteriously as he had appeared. Just as the man was about to drag her through the exit, a voice rang out. "Let her go." It was Thomas. He was standing a few feet away, his face grim, his eyes blazing with anger. He looked different. Stronger, harder, his eyes reflecting a depth of experience that she couldn't fathom. He was no longer the young, idealistic captain she had known. He was a man who had seen the darkness, a man who had been forged in the crucible of war and secrecy. The man holding Rose hesitated, his grip loosening slightly. He looked at Thomas, his expression a mixture of surprise and fear. "Sinclair," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "You weren't supposed to be here." "I go where I please," Thomas said, his voice cold and steely. "And I'm telling you, let her go." The man released Rose, his hand dropping to his side. He took a step back, his eyes darting between Thomas and the exit. "This isn't over, Sinclair," he said, his voice filled with menace. "You can't hide forever." He turned and vanished through the exit, disappearing into the bustling crowds outside the museum. Rose stood there, trembling, her heart pounding, her gaze fixed on Thomas. He looked at her, his expression softening slightly. "Rose," he said, his voice hoarse, "are you all right?" She nodded, unable to speak, tears welling up in her eyes. He was here. He was real. He had saved her. He took a step towards her, and then he stopped. He looked around the hall, his eyes scanning the faces, as if searching for someone or something. "We can't talk here," he said, his voice low. "It's not safe. Meet me Arlington Cemetery. Tomorrow at dawn. Near the tomb of the unknown soldier." He turned and walked away, disappearing into the crowd before she could respond. Rose stood there, stunned, her mind reeling. Arlington Cemetery. The tomb of the unknown soldier. It was a place of remembrance, of sacrifice, of secrets. It was a fitting place for their reunion, a place where the ghosts of the past met the realities of the present. The secret of Arlington Cemetery, she suspected, was not just about the unknown soldiers buried there, but about the living soldier who was finally ready to reveal his own hidden truth. Chapter 10. Betrayal in the Diplomatic Corps. Dawn at Arlington Cemetery was a breathtaking spectacle. The rising sun cast a golden glow over the rows of white headstones, a silent testament to the sacrifices made by generations of soldiers. The air was crisp and cool, carrying the scent of dew-covered grass and the distant sound of birdsong. It was a place of peace, of remembrance, a stark contrast to the turmoil and uncertainty that had consumed Rose's life for the past 5 years. She arrived at the tomb of the unknown soldier a few minutes before dawn, her heart pounding with a mixture of anticipation and trepidation. She had spent another sleepless night, replaying the events at the Smithsonian, Thomas's sudden appearance, his rescue, his cryptic message. She had so many questions, so many unanswered fears. She stood near the tomb, watching the changing of the guard, a solemn and moving ceremony that underscored the gravity of the place, the weight of history that surrounded her. The precision of the movements, the silence of the soldiers, the reverence of the onlookers, it all created a sense of profound respect, of hallowed ground. As the ceremony concluded, she saw him. He was standing a short distance away, near a cluster of oak trees, his silhouette outlined against the rising sun. He was wearing a simple overcoat, his face partially obscured by the shadows. It was Thomas. She walked towards him, her steps hesitant, her heart filled with a mix of emotions she couldn't quite define. He turned to face her as she approached, his expression guarded. "Rose," he said, his voice low, his eyes searching hers. "Thomas," she whispered, her voice choked with emotion. They stood there for a long moment, their gaze locked, the years of separation, of uncertainty, of unanswered questions, hanging heavy in the air between them. I didn't know if you would come," she said, her voice trembling. He smiled, a fleeting, almost imperceptible smile. "I had to see you, Rose. I had to explain." He gestured towards a nearby bench, and they sat down, the silence broken only by the distant sound of traffic and the chirping of birds. "Where have you been?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper.
"What happened to you?"
He took a deep breath, his gaze fixed on the distant horizon. "It's a long story, Rose. A complicated story." He began to speak, his voice low and measured, recounting the events of the past 5 years, the events that had led to his disappearance, his hidden life, his return. He told her about Operation Nightingale, the secretive intelligence operation he had been recruited into during the final months of the war. He had been chosen for his fluency in French and German, his knowledge of the terrain, his ability to blend in. He had been tasked with gathering information, infiltrating enemy lines, carrying out clandestine missions. On the day he disappeared, he had been on a mission to deliver a coded message to a contact in a small village near Ypres. He had been ambushed, captured by a group of German soldiers. He had been tortured, interrogated, but he had refused to reveal any information. He had managed to escape, with the help of a sympathetic French farmer, but he had been severely injured, both physically and mentally. He had suffered from amnesia, losing all memory of his past life, of his identity, of Rose. He had spent months wandering the countryside, working odd jobs, slowly piecing his memory back together. It was a long, arduous process, filled with fragments of images, fleeting memories, and a constant, nagging sense of something missing. Eventually, he had made his way to Paris, where he had been contacted by members of Operation Nightingale. They had known who he was, had been searching for him. They had offered him a choice: return to his former life, or continue working for them. He had chosen to stay, to continue serving his country, even though it meant remaining hidden, living a life of secrecy and deception. He had been assigned a new identity, a new role, working as a liaison between the American and British intelligence agencies.
Why didn't you contact me?
Rose asked, her voice filled with a mixture of anger and hurt. Why did you let me believe you were dead? He looked at her, his eyes filled with pain and regret. I couldn't, Rose. It was too dangerous. For both of us. I was involved in sensitive operations. My enemies, they would have used you to get to me.
But the telegram, she said, the altered telegram.
Someone knew you were alive. He nodded. Arthur Caldwell. He was my handler. He knew I was alive, but he also knew that I couldn't come back. He made the decision to keep me hidden, to protect me, to protect the operation. He revealed the betrayal in the diplomatic corps. Several high-ranking officials, motivated by personal gain and foreign influence, were secretly working against American interests, leaking sensitive information, and sabotaging diplomatic efforts. Thomas's mission was to uncover their identities and expose their treachery. But it's been 5 years, Rose said, tears welling in her eyes. 5 years of my life wasted. He reached out and took her hand, his touch sending a shiver through her. I know, Rose. And I'm so sorry. I never wanted to hurt you. I thought I was doing the right thing.
And now?
She asked, her voice trembling. What happens now? He looked at her, his eyes filled with a mixture of love and uncertainty. I don't know, Rose. I'm still involved. The operation, it's not over yet. He paused, looked around as though to check no one was nearby.
But
I won't lose you again. Those simple words were a balm on her wounded heart. It was the first glimmer of hope, of a shared future that she'd had since seeing him again. The betrayal he'd uncovered, the one he'd been a part of by letting her believe he was dead, it was a heavy weight. But his words, his touch, they offered a path forward. A path she wasn't sure she was ready to take, but a path she couldn't ignore. Chapter 11. The Decoding of a Soldier's Heart. The revelation of Thomas's continued involvement in the clandestine world of espionage left Rose reeling. While she understood his reasons, his sense of duty, the years of deception still stung. She had mourned him, rebuilt her life, only to discover he was alive, living a secret existence just miles away. The dawn meeting at Arlington had provided answers, but it had also raised a host of new questions, new anxieties. She was torn between her love for him, the joy of his return, and the fear of the dangerous world he inhabited. What can I do? She asked, her voice barely a whisper, the vast expanse of the cemetery seeming to amplify the uncertainty of their situation. Thomas squeezed her hand, his touch reassuring, but his eyes still held a shadow of worry.
You can help me, Rose.
But it's dangerous. Are you sure you're willing to risk it? She met his gaze, her own filled with a newfound determination. She had already risked everything, her heart, her peace of mind, her future.
She wasn't about to back down now.
I've already lost you once, Thomas, she said, her voice firm.
I won't lose you again.
Tell me what I need to do. He explained that the key to exposing the betrayal within the diplomatic corps lay in a series of coded messages, hidden within seemingly innocuous diplomatic correspondence. He had managed to intercept some of these messages, but he needed help deciphering them. He believed Rose, with her sharp mind and her knowledge of languages, could be the key to unlocking the code. The messages are disguised as routine diplomatic cables, he explained, but they contain a hidden layer of code, a complex cipher that I haven't been able to crack. I believe it's based on a series of historical texts, literary references, something only someone with a deep understanding of literature and history would be able to decipher. Rose's mind immediately went to her father, a professor of literature at Georgetown University. He had instilled in her a love of books, a passion for language, a keen eye for detail. She had spent countless hours in his study, surrounded by dusty tomes and whispered conversations about Shakespeare, Milton, and the intricacies of ancient Greek. "I think I can do it, Thomas," she said, her voice filled with a growing confidence. "I have a certain aptitude for these things." He smiled, a genuine smile that reached his eyes, a smile that reminded her of the man she had fallen in love with, the man she had thought she had lost forever. "I know you can, Rose," he said. "I have faith in you." He gave her a small, encrypted document, a copy of one of the intercepted messages. It looked like a standard diplomatic cable, filled with mundane details about trade negotiations and political appointments. But Rose knew that beneath the surface, hidden within the carefully chosen words, lay a secret message, a message that could expose a network of treachery and betrayal. She returned to her townhouse, her mind buzzing with the challenge ahead. She spent the rest of the day poring over the document, analyzing every word, every phrase, searching for patterns, anomalies, anything that might hint at the underlying code. She worked late into the night, fueled by coffee and a fierce determination. She tried various ciphers, different keys, historical references, literary allusions. But nothing seemed to work. The code remained stubbornly resistant, its secrets locked within a seemingly impenetrable wall of words. Frustrated, she pushed the document aside and closed her eyes, letting her mind wander. She thought about Thomas, about his bravery, his dedication, his unwavering love for her. She thought about the risks he was taking, the dangers he faced. And she knew she couldn't fail him. She opened her eyes and looked at the document again, this time with a fresh perspective. She noticed something she hadn't seen before. A recurring phrase, a seemingly insignificant detail, repeated several times throughout the message. "The Gardens of Hesperides," she murmured, her heart skipping a beat. The Gardens of Hesperides, a mythical garden in Greek mythology, guarded by a fearsome dragon and containing golden apples that granted immortality. It was a reference she knew well, a story her father had often told her. Could it be? Could the code be based on Greek mythology? She grabbed a book of Greek myths from her shelf and began to search for clues. She found references to various gods, goddesses, heroes, and creatures, each with their own unique attributes and stories. She realized that the code was not a simple substitution cipher, but a complex system of references, allusions, and symbolic meanings. Each word, each phrase, in the coded message corresponded to a specific character or event in Greek mythology. She spent the next few hours meticulously decoding the message, using her knowledge of Greek mythology and her intuition to piece together the hidden meaning. It was a painstaking process, but she was driven by a sense of urgency, a feeling that she was on the verge of a breakthrough. Finally, after hours of work, she had it. The decoded message. It was a list of names, the names of the high-ranking officials involved in the betrayal. And at the top of the list, a name that sent a chill down her spine, Senator Harrison, the host of a society ball where she had first seen Thomas again. Rose stared at the decoded message, her mind reeling. Senator Harrison, a powerful and influential figure in Washington society, a man she had considered a friend, was a traitor. He had been using his position, his influence, to undermine American interests, to betray his country. The decoding of a soldier's heart, she realized, was more than just cracking a code. It was about understanding the motivations, the betrayals, the sacrifices that lay beneath the surface of duty and loyalty. And now, she had the key to exposing it all. Chapter 12. Echoes of Gunfire in Georgetown. The revelation of Senator Harrison's treachery was a heavy blow. He was a man of immense power and influence, a man who could easily crush anyone who dared to oppose him. Rose knew that exposing him would be dangerous, that it could put both her and Thomas at risk. But she also knew that she couldn't stand by and do nothing. She had a duty, a responsibility, to expose the truth, no matter the cost. She immediately contacted Eleanor, sharing the decoded message and the shocking discovery. Eleanor was equally stunned, but her reaction was one of immediate action. "We need to get this information to the right people, Rose," she said, her voice firm. "Someone we can trust, someone who has the power to act." They discussed various options, weighing the risks and benefits of each. They considered contacting the War Department, the State Department, even the President himself. But they knew that Harrison had allies in high places, that he could easily quash any investigation, any attempt to expose him. They decided to contact a journalist, a man named Robert Matthews, a reporter for the Washington Post known for his integrity and his relentless pursuit of truth. Matthews had a reputation for exposing corruption and holding the powerful accountable. He was their best hope. Rose arranged a meeting with Matthews, choosing a secluded location, a small, out-of-the-way cafe in Georgetown. She shared the decoded message and the evidence she had gathered, her voice trembling slightly as she recounted the story of Thomas's disappearance and his subsequent involvement in Operation Nightingale. Matthews listened intently, his eyes narrowing as he absorbed the information. He asked probing questions, challenging her assumptions, testing the validity of her claims. He was a seasoned journalist, skeptical and thorough, but Rose could see a flicker of excitement in his eyes, a sense that he knew he was on to a big story. "This is explosive, Mrs. Kensington," he said, his voice low. "If what you're saying is true, this could bring down the entire government." "It is true, Mr. Matthews," Rose said, her voice firm. "I have proof. And I have a witness." She explained that Thomas was willing to come forward, to testify about his experiences, to expose Harrison's treachery. But she also stressed the need for caution, the danger that Thomas would be in if his identity were revealed prematurely. Matthews agreed to protect Thomas's identity, to publish the story without revealing his source. He promised to investigate further, to corroborate Rose's claims, to gather additional evidence. Rose left the meeting feeling a sense of relief, but also a growing sense of unease. She had set in motion a chain of events that could have far-reaching consequences she couldn't fully predict. As she walked home, she noticed a familiar car, the same black Ford sedan that had been following her before. It was parked across the street from her townhouse, its occupants watching her intently. She knew then that Harrison was aware of her actions, that he knew she was a threat. She was no longer just a grieving widow, a curious investigator. She was a target. She entered her townhouse, locking the door behind her, her heart pounding with fear. She checked the windows, making sure they were securely fastened. She felt a sense of vulnerability, a feeling that she was being watched, that she was no longer safe in her own home. She spent the evening in darkness, sitting in her living room, listening to the sounds of the city outside. The distant rumble of traffic, the occasional siren, the muffled voices of passers-by, they all seemed to carry a sense of menace, a threat of impending danger. Suddenly, she heard a noise, a loud crash, coming from the back of the house. She froze, her heart leaping into her throat. Someone was inside. She grabbed a heavy candlestick from the mantelpiece, her hands trembling, her mind racing. She crept silently towards the back of the house, her senses on high alert. She reached the kitchen, and there, in the dim light filtering through the window, she saw him. It was one of the men who had been following her, the man who had accosted her at the Smithsonian. He was standing in the middle of the kitchen, his face contorted in anger, a gun in his hand. "Where is it?" he demanded, his voice harsh. "Where's the document?" Rose knew he was talking about the decoded message, the evidence that could expose Harrison. She had hidden it, carefully, in a secret compartment behind a loose brick in the fireplace. "I don't know what you're talking about," she stammered, her voice trembling. The man raised the gun, pointing it directly at her. "Don't lie to me, Mrs. Kensington. We know you have it, and we're prepared to do whatever it takes to get it back." Rose stood her ground, her grip tightening on the candlestick. She knew she was outmatched, outgunned, but she refused to be intimidated. She wouldn't let him have the document, wouldn't let him silence her. Suddenly, a shot rang out. The man crumpled to the floor, the gun falling from his hand. Rose stood there, stunned, her ears ringing, her eyes wide with disbelief. She looked towards the doorway, and there, silhouetted against the dim light, stood Thomas. He was holding a gun, his face grim, his eyes filled with a mixture of anger and relief. He had saved her, again. But the echoes of gunfire in Georgetown were a stark reminder of the danger they were in, the price of truth, the cost of betrayal. The quiet, peaceful streets had become a battleground, and she was caught in the crossfire. Chapter 13. The Price of Silence, the Cost of Truth. The aftermath of the shooting was a blur of chaos and fear. Thomas quickly and efficiently secured the scene, checking the intruder for signs of life there were none, and ensuring that Rose was unharmed. The echoes of the gunshots still reverberated through the quiet Georgetown townhouse, a stark reminder of the violence that had intruded upon their lives. "We have to go, Rose," Thomas said, his voice urgent, his eyes scanning the street outside the window. "They'll be back. They know you have the document, and they'll stop at nothing to get it." Rose nodded, her mind reeling, her body trembling from the shock of what had just happened. She quickly gathered a few essential belongings, including the decoded message, carefully hidden within the lining of her handbag. Thomas led her out of the townhouse, through the back alley, avoiding the main streets. They moved quickly and quietly, blending into the shadows, their senses on high alert. They found refuge in a safe house, a small, nondescript apartment in a quiet neighborhood, far from Georgetown. It was one of several safe houses maintained by Operation Nightingale, used for clandestine meetings and emergency situations. The apartment was sparsely furnished, but it was clean and secure. Thomas locked the door, checking the windows, his movements precise and efficient. He was a soldier, trained to survive, to protect, to anticipate danger. Rose sat on the edge of the bed, her hands clasped tightly in her lap, trying to calm her racing heart. She had never experienced such violence, such fear, such a palpable sense of danger. "Who was he?" she asked, her voice trembling. "Why did he want to kill me?" Thomas sat down beside her, his hand reaching out to cover hers. "He was one of Harrison's men," he said, his voice low. "A hired assassin. He was sent to retrieve the document and to silence you." Rose felt a chill run down her spine. The price of silence, she realized, was her life. And the cost of truth, the exposure of Harrison's treachery, was a constant threat, a shadow that loomed over them. "What do we do now?" she asked, her voice filled with uncertainty. Thomas looked at her, his eyes filled with a mixture of determination and concern. "We go to Matthews," he said. "We give him the document and we tell him everything. He's our only hope now." They spent the night in the safe house, unable to sleep, their minds racing, their ears straining for any sound that might indicate danger. They talked, sharing their fears, their hopes, their plans. They spoke of their past, of the life they had shared before the war, of the dreams they had cherished. They spoke of their future, of the possibility of a life together, a life free from secrecy and danger. But they both knew that that future was uncertain, that it depended on their ability to expose Harrison and survive the consequences. The next morning, they contacted Matthews, arranging a meeting at a neutral location, a public park in the heart of Washington. They chose a crowded area, hoping that the presence of other people would deter any further attempts on their lives. They arrived at the park separately, taking different routes, blending into the crowds. They met near a fountain, their eyes constantly scanning the surroundings, searching for any sign of surveillance, any hint of danger. They gave Matthews the decoded message, along with a detailed account of the events of the past few weeks, including the shooting at Rose's townhouse. Matthews listened intently, his eyes widening as he absorbed the information. "This is incredible, Mrs. Kensington. Captain Sinclair," he said, his voice filled with a mixture of excitement and apprehension. "This is the biggest story of my career. But it's also the most dangerous." "We know," Thomas said, his voice firm. "But we're prepared to take the risk. We have to expose Harrison, no matter the cost." Matthews promised to publish the story as soon as possible to protect their identities, to ensure their safety. He assured them that he had sources within the government, within the intelligence community, who could corroborate their claims and protect them from Harrison's reach. Rose and Thomas left the meeting feeling a sense of cautious optimism, but also a lingering sense of vulnerability. They had done everything they could, had placed their trust in Matthews, in the power of the press, in the hope for justice. But they knew that Harrison was a powerful and ruthless enemy, that he would not go down without a fight. The price of silence had been averted, but the cost of truth was still uncertain. They were walking a tightrope, balancing between exposure and survival, between justice and retribution. And they knew that one wrong step, one miscalculation, could send them tumbling into the abyss. Chapter 14. A Rendezvous at the Tidal Basin. The days following their meeting with Matthews were filled with a tense, nerve-wracking anticipation. Rose and Thomas remained hidden in the safe house, their lives reduced to a small, confined space, their only connection to the outside world a crackling radio and the occasional, furtive phone call from Matthews. The journalist was working feverishly, verifying their story, gathering additional evidence, and preparing for the inevitable backlash from Harrison and his allies. He had warned them that the publication of the story would be like detonating a bomb in the heart of Washington, that it would unleash a firestorm of controversy and intrigue. Rose and Thomas spent their time huddled together, sharing whispered conversations, finding solace in each other's presence. They were two souls bound together by love, by loss, by a shared ordeal that had tested their strength and resilience. They spoke of their future, of the life they hoped to build together, once the storm had passed. They dreamed of a quiet life, far from the intrigue and danger of Washington, a life where they could finally be together, without secrets, without fear. But the reality of their situation was always present, a shadow that loomed over their hopes and dreams. They knew that Harrison was a powerful and ruthless enemy, that he would stop at nothing to protect himself, to silence them. One evening, Thomas received a coded message, a brief, cryptic communication from an anonymous source within Operation Nightingale. The message indicated that Harrison was planning a desperate move, a last-ditch effort to salvage his reputation and escape justice. The message was vague, lacking specific details, but it hinted at a meeting, a rendezvous, that was scheduled to take place the following night. The location was given only as the place where the water reflects the sky. Rose and Thomas immediately understood the reference. It was the tidal basin, a picturesque body of water near the Jefferson Memorial, famous for its reflecting pool that mirrored the sky and the surrounding monuments. "He's meeting someone," Thomas said, his voice grim. "Someone who can help him escape. Someone who can provide him with a new identity, a new life." "We have to stop him," Rose said, her voice filled with determination. "We can't let him get away." They knew that confronting Harrison directly would be dangerous, that it could lead to another violent confrontation. But they also knew that it was their only chance to prevent him from escaping justice, to ensure that he was held accountable for his crimes. They decided to go to the tidal basin, to observe the meeting, to gather evidence, and, if possible, to alert the authorities. They knew it was a risky plan, but they felt they had no other choice. They arrived at the tidal basin late that night, under the cover of darkness. The moon was full, casting a silvery glow over the water, reflecting the surrounding monuments in its shimmering surface. It was a beautiful, serene scene, but Rose and Thomas felt only a sense of dread, of impending danger. They found a secluded spot, hidden amongst the cherry trees that lined the basin, their eyes constantly scanning the area, searching for any sign of Harrison, any hint of his presence. The hours passed slowly, the silence broken only by the gentle lapping of the water against the shore and the occasional rustling of leaves in the breeze. Rose and Thomas huddled together, their hands clasped tightly, their senses on high alert. And then they saw him. Harrison arrived, accompanied by two other men, both of whom looked like they belonged in the shadowy world of espionage. They met near the edge of the water, their voices low and muffled, their figures silhouetted against the moonlit sky. Rose and Thomas watched from their hiding place, their hearts pounding, their breath held tight. They couldn't hear the conversation, but they could see the intensity of the exchange, the furtive glances, the sense of urgency. Suddenly, Thomas recognized one of the men accompanying Harrison. It was Arthur Caldwell, his former handler from Operation Nightingale, the man who had orchestrated his disappearance, the man who had kept him hidden for so long. Caldwell, Thomas whispered, his voice filled with a mixture of disbelief and betrayal. He's working with Harrison. He's helping him escape. Rose felt a surge of anger, of outrage. Caldwell, the man who had claimed to be protecting Thomas, was now aiding his enemy, facilitating his escape. It was the ultimate betrayal, a final twist in a long and tortuous saga. The rendezvous at the tidal basin, under the serene reflection of the moon, was a scene of treachery, a stark contrast between the beauty of the surroundings and the ugliness of the actions unfolding before them. The calm water mirrored the sky, but it also reflected a deeper, darker truth: the lengths to which people would go to protect their power, their secrets, their lies. Chapter 15. The Spy Among Us. The realization that Caldwell, Thomas's former handler and the architect of his hidden life, was now complicit in Harrison's escape plan was a devastating blow. It shattered any remaining illusions Thomas had about the integrity of Operation Nightingale, about the loyalty of the people he had once trusted. "I can't believe it," Thomas muttered, his voice filled with a mixture of anger and disbelief. "Caldwell, he was like a father figure to me. He trained me, he guided me, he betrayed me." Rose placed a comforting hand on his arm, her heart aching for him. She knew how much this betrayal hurt, how deeply it cut. "We can't let them get away, Thomas," she said, her voice firm. "We have to stop them." They watched as Harrison and Caldwell exchanged a briefcase, a silent transaction that likely contained money, false documents, and the means for Harrison to disappear, to start a new life under a false identity. Thomas knew they had to act quickly. He couldn't confront them directly, not with two other men present. He needed to alert the authorities, to bring in reinforcements. He slipped away from their hiding place, moving silently through the shadows, his military training kicking in. He found a nearby payphone and called Matthews, briefing him on the situation, urging him to contact his sources within the government, to send the police to the tidal basin. He returned to Rose's side, his face grim, his eyes filled with a mixture of determination and apprehension. "Matthews is on it," he said. "He's contacting his people. But it might take time. We have to stall them, Rose. We have to prevent them from leaving." They decided to create a distraction, something that would draw attention to Harrison and Caldwell, something that would delay their escape. Rose had an idea. She remembered seeing a group of late-night revelers near the Jefferson Memorial, a group of young people celebrating a birthday, their laughter and music echoing across the water. "I'll go to them," she said. I'll tell them I saw someone suspicious near the water. I'll create a commotion, draw their attention to Harrison and Caldwell." It was a risky plan, but it was their best option. Thomas hesitated, his concern for her safety evident in his eyes. "Are you sure, Rose?" he asked. "It could be dangerous." She met his gaze, her own filled with a newfound courage. "I have to do something, Thomas. I can't just stand here and watch them get away." She slipped away from their hiding place, moving quickly and quietly towards the Jefferson Memorial. She approached the group of revelers, her heart pounding, her mind racing. She told them a fabricated story, a tale of a suspicious man lurking near the water, a man who looked like he was up to no good. She exaggerated her fear, her anxiety, her voice trembling with feigned emotion. The young people, fueled by alcohol and a sense of youthful bravado, were eager to investigate. They followed Rose towards the tidal basin, their laughter and chatter echoing through the night. As they approached the spot where Harrison and Caldwell were standing, Rose pointed them out, her voice rising in a crescendo of feigned panic. "There they are," she cried. "Those are the men I saw. They look dangerous." Harrison and Caldwell, startled by the sudden commotion, turned to face the approaching group. They looked confused, then alarmed, as they realized they had been discovered. The young people, emboldened by their numbers and their sense of righteous indignation, confronted Harrison and Caldwell, demanding to know what they were doing. Harrison tried to dismiss them, to wave them away, but they were persistent, their questions growing more insistent, their voices louder. Caldwell, sensing that the situation was spiraling out of control, tried to intervene, but it was too late. The distraction had worked. The attention of the revelers and of several passers-by was now focused on Harrison and Caldwell. Suddenly, sirens wailed in the distance, growing louder with each passing second. The police were on their way. Harrison and Caldwell exchanged a look of panic. They knew they had been caught. The police arrived, their cars screeching to a halt near the tidal basin. They quickly apprehended Harrison and Caldwell, along with the third man, taking them into custody. Rose watched from a distance, her heart pounding with a mixture of relief and triumph. They had done it. They had stopped Harrison from escaping. They had exposed his treachery. Thomas joined her, his arm wrapping around her shoulders, his presence a comforting reassurance. "You were amazing, Rose," he said, his voice filled with admiration. "You were brave, resourceful, you saved the day." She leaned against him, her body trembling from the adrenaline rush, the emotional exhaustion. "We did it together, Thomas," she said. "We faced the darkness, and we found the light." The spy among us, Caldwell, the man who had manipulated them both, was finally exposed. The tidal basin, once a scene of treachery, was now a place of justice, a testament to their courage, their resilience, their unwavering love for each other. But even as they celebrated this victory, Rose knew that the repercussions would ripple outwards, touching many lives, changing the landscape of Washington forever. Chapter 16. Flight from the Capitol. The arrest of Senator Harrison and Arthur Caldwell sent shockwaves through Washington. The news of their treachery, their involvement in a conspiracy to undermine American interests, dominated the headlines, sparking a firestorm of controversy and political upheaval. Matthews's article, published in the Washington Post, detailed the entire story, from Thomas's disappearance during the war to Rose's courageous investigation and the final confrontation at the tidal basin. The article was a masterpiece of investigative journalism, a meticulously researched and powerfully written expose that shook the foundations of the American government. Rose and Thomas, however, were not able to savor their victory. They were still in danger. Harrison's allies, those who had benefited from his corruption and those who feared exposure, were still at large. They were powerful and ruthless, and they would stop at nothing to silence those who had brought Harrison down. Matthews, along with his contacts within the government, advised Rose and Thomas to leave Washington, to disappear, to seek refuge in a safe location until the dust settled and the full extent of Harrison's network could be uncovered. "You're not safe here," Matthews warned them. "Harrison has friends in high places, people who can make your lives difficult. You need to get out of the city, out of the country if possible." Thomas, with his experience in covert operations, agreed. He knew that they were vulnerable, that their lives were at risk. He had contacts, resources, remnants of Operation Nightingale that he could still call upon. They decided to flee, to seek refuge in a remote location, far from the reach of Harrison's allies. They chose a small, isolated cabin in the Blue Ridge Mountains of Virginia, a place where they could hide, regroup, and plan their next move. They left Washington under the cover of darkness, traveling in a nondescript car provided by one of Matthews's contacts. They drove through the night, the city lights fading behind them, the vast expanse of the countryside unfolding before them. They arrived at the cabin before dawn, a small, rustic structure nestled amongst the trees, overlooking a valley shrouded in mist. It was a place of peace, of solitude, a stark contrast to the turmoil and danger they had left behind. The cabin was sparsely furnished, but it had everything they needed: a fireplace, a comfortable bed, a small kitchen, and a sense of security, a feeling that they were finally safe, at least for the time being. They spent the first few days in the cabin simply resting, recovering from the emotional and physical exhaustion of the past few weeks. They slept, they ate, they talked, they held each other close, finding solace in their shared love and their shared ordeal. But they knew that their flight from the capital was only a temporary reprieve, that they couldn't hide forever. They had to decide what to do next, how to rebuild their lives, how to ensure their safety and their future. Thomas began to make plans, contacting old friends, former colleagues from his days in the military and in Operation Nightingale. He needed to assess the situation, to determine the extent of Harrison's reach, to identify those who were still a threat. Rose, meanwhile, began to write. She documented their experiences, chronicling their journey from grief and loss to discovery and danger. She wrote about Thomas's disappearance, her investigation, the altered telegram, the society ball, the shooting, the decoding of the messages, the confrontation at the tidal basin, and their flight from the capital. She wrote not for publication, but for herself, for Thomas, for the future. She wrote to make sense of what had happened, to process her emotions, to preserve their story, to ensure that their experiences would not be forgotten. Their flight from the capital was a necessary escape, a temporary refuge from the storm. But it was also a turning point, a moment of reflection, a time to heal, to plan, to prepare for the challenges that still lay ahead. The cabin in the Blue Ridge Mountains was a sanctuary, a place where they could find peace, solitude, and the strength to face the uncertain future together. Chapter 17. The Safe House in the Blue Ridge Mountains. The cabin in the Blue Ridge Mountains became their sanctuary, a refuge from the storm that had engulfed their lives in Washington. The days were quiet, filled with the sounds of nature, the wind rustling through the trees, the birds singing in the branches, the distant rush of a mountain stream. The nights were dark and still, illuminated only by the moon and the stars, a vast expanse of sky that seemed to stretch on forever. Rose and Thomas settled into a routine, a rhythm of life that was both peaceful and purposeful. They spent their days exploring the surrounding woods, hiking along mountain trails, discovering hidden waterfalls and breathtaking vistas. They found solace in the beauty of nature, in the simplicity of their surroundings, in the absence of the constant threat that had shadowed their lives in Washington. Thomas continued to make discreet inquiries, using his network of contacts to gather information about the ongoing investigation into Harrison's conspiracy. He learned that the arrests at the tidal basin had triggered a cascade of revelations, that more and more officials were being implicated, that the scandal was reaching the highest levels of government. He also learned that Harrison's allies were still active, that they were trying to cover their tracks, to silence witnesses, to obstruct the investigation. He knew that he and Rose were still in danger, that their location was a secret that had to be protected at all costs. Rose continued to write, filling notebooks with her observations, her reflections, her memories. She wrote about her love for Thomas, about the pain of his loss, about the joy of his return, about the challenges they had faced together. She wrote about the strength she had found within herself, the courage she had discovered in the face of adversity. One evening, as they sat by the fireplace, watching the flames dance and flicker, Rose shared some of her writing with Thomas. She read aloud a passage describing their first meeting, a chance encounter at a hospital during the war, a moment that had changed both of their lives forever. Thomas listened intently, his eyes filled with emotion. He reached out and took her hand, his touch sending a shiver of warmth through her. "You have a gift, Rose," he said, his voice soft. "You capture the essence of things, the beauty, the pain, the truth." She smiled, her heart filled with a sense of gratitude, of love, of connection. "It's our story, Thomas," she said. "It's the story of our lives." They talked late into the night, sharing their hopes and dreams for the future. They spoke of finding a place to settle down, a place where they could live in peace, without fear, without secrets. They spoke of starting a family, of building a life together, a life that had been stolen from them for so long. They started discussing possibly moving to Europe, somewhere quiet, somewhere they were unknown. But they also knew that their past, their experiences, would always be a part of them, that the scars of war and betrayal would never fully heal. They had learned the price of silence, the cost of truth, the fragility of life, and the enduring power of love. As the days turned into weeks, the safe house in the Blue Ridge Mountains became more than just a refuge. It became a home, a place of healing, of renewal, of hope. It was a place where they could reconnect, rediscover each other, and rebuild their lives together. It was a testament to their resilience, their courage, and their unwavering love, a love that had survived the horrors of war, the years of separation, and the dangers of a conspiracy that had threatened to destroy them both. The mountains, silent and steadfast, were witnesses to their quiet rebirth. Chapter 18. Scars of the Past, Promises of the Future. Life in the Blue Ridge Mountains settled into a peaceful rhythm, a stark contrast to the chaos and danger they had left behind in Washington. The days were marked by the simple routines of rural life: chopping wood, tending a small garden, cooking meals over an open fire. The nights were filled with quiet conversation, shared reading, and the comforting warmth of the fireplace. Rose continued to write, her notebooks filling with the details of their new life, the beauty of their surroundings, the slow, steady healing of their hearts. She found solace in the act of writing, in the process of transforming their experiences into words, in the hope that their story might one day inspire others. Thomas, while still cautious, began to relax, to shed the weight of the secrecy and deception that had burdened him for so long. He spent hours exploring the surrounding woods, rediscovering his love of nature, finding peace in the solitude of the mountains. One day, while hiking along a remote trail, he stumbled upon an old, abandoned homestead, a crumbling stone house surrounded by overgrown fields and a neglected orchard. The house was in disrepair, its windows broken, its roof sagging, but there was a sense of history, of resilience, that resonated with him. He felt drawn to the place, a sense of connection to the past, a vision of the future. He saw the potential for renewal, for restoration, for creating a home, a life that was rooted in the land, connected to nature, far from the turmoil and intrigue of the city. He brought Rose to the homestead, showing her the crumbling house, the overgrown fields, the neglected orchard. He shared his vision, his dream of restoring the place, of building a life together, a life that was simple, peaceful, and meaningful. Rose was initially hesitant. The house was in a terrible state. The work required to restore it would be immense, the isolation daunting. But she saw the spark in Thomas's eyes, the passion in his voice, the hope that had been rekindled within him. She looked around, seeing beyond the decay, beyond the neglect. She saw the beauty of the surrounding landscape, the potential for a garden, for an orchard, for a life lived in harmony with nature. She saw a home, a future, a place where they could heal, where they could finally be together, without fear, without secrets. "It's beautiful, Thomas," she said, her voice filled with a growing sense of excitement. "It's a lot of work, but it's perfect." They spent the next few weeks exploring the homestead, making plans, dreaming of the future. They researched the history of the place, learning about the families who had lived there before, the lives they had built, the challenges they had faced. They discovered that the house had been built in the early 19th century by a family of farmers who had cleared the land, planted crops, and raised livestock. The house had been abandoned during the Civil War, its occupants fleeing the conflict, leaving behind their dreams, their hopes, their home. Rose and Thomas felt a connection to those who had come before them, a sense of shared history, a shared resilience. They were determined to restore the homestead, to honor the past, to build a future. They began the arduous task of cleaning up the property, clearing away the debris, repairing the fences, preparing the ground for planting. It was hard work, physically demanding, but it was also therapeutic, a way to heal, to reconnect, to build something tangible, something lasting. As they worked, they talked, sharing their memories, their fears, their hopes. They spoke of the scars of the past, the wounds that war and betrayal had inflicted upon them. They spoke of the promises of the future, the dreams they shared, the life they were building together. They were both permanently changed, that was unarguable. But they were choosing to change together, to grow together. The scars of the past, they realized, were not just marks of pain, but symbols of resilience, of survival, of the enduring power of love. And the promises of the future, while uncertain, were filled with hope, with possibility, with the chance to create a life that was meaningful, fulfilling, and true. The old homestead, with its crumbling walls and overgrown fields, was a symbol of their own journey, a testament to their ability to rebuild, to restore, to renew. Chapter 19. The Unveiling of Captain Sinclair. As Rose and Thomas worked to restore the homestead, news from Washington continued to filter in through Matthews's discreet communications. The investigation into Harrison's conspiracy was progressing, more arrests were being made, and the full extent of the corruption was slowly being revealed. Matthews informed them that Harrison had been formally charged with treason, conspiracy, and obstruction of justice. Caldwell, facing overwhelming evidence of his complicity, had agreed to cooperate with the authorities, providing detailed information about Harrison's network and the inner workings of Operation Nightingale. The revelations about Operation Nightingale were particularly shocking. The once secret intelligence operation, tasked with protecting American interests during the war, had become corrupted, infiltrated by foreign agents, and used for personal gain by individuals like Harrison and Caldwell. The scandal rocked the intelligence community, leading to a major overhaul of its structure, its protocols, and its oversight. The ideals of duty, honor, and service had been tarnished, replaced by greed, betrayal, and a lust for power. Matthews also informed them that the government was preparing to officially exonerate Thomas, to clear his name, to restore his reputation, and to acknowledge his service and his sacrifice. The declaration of missing in action, presumed dead, would be rescinded, replaced by a formal commendation for bravery, for dedication, for his unwavering commitment to his country. Thomas received the news with mixed emotions. He was relieved to be finally vindicated, to have his name cleared, to be recognized for his service. But he was also saddened by the corruption that had been exposed, by the betrayal of those he had once trusted, by the damage that had been done to the ideals he had once held so dear. "It's bittersweet, Rose," he said, his voice filled with a mixture of relief and regret. "I'm glad it's over, but it's hard to accept that so many people I respected, people I trusted, were involved in such treachery." Rose understood his feelings. She had witnessed firsthand the devastating consequences of that treachery, the pain it had caused, the lives it had shattered. "It's important to remember the good, Thomas," she said, her voice soft. "The people who fought for what was right, the people who risked their lives to expose the truth. You were one of them. You are one of them." He looked at her, his eyes filled with gratitude, with love, with a renewed sense of purpose. "We were," he corrected. "We did it together." A few weeks later, Matthews contacted them with an urgent request. The government was planning a formal ceremony, a public unveiling of Captain Thomas Sinclair, a recognition of his service and his sacrifice. They wanted Thomas to attend, to speak, to share his story with the world. Thomas was reluctant. He had grown accustomed to the quiet life in the mountains, the anonymity, the peace. He had no desire to return to Washington, to the spotlight, to the world of politics and intrigue. But Rose convinced him. She argued that it was important for him to tell his story, to honor the memory of those who had died, to expose the truth about Operation Nightingale, to help ensure that such corruption would never happen again. "It's your duty, Thomas," she said. "It's your responsibility. You have a voice, and you need to use it." He eventually agreed, recognizing the importance of the occasion, the opportunity to set the record straight, to reclaim his identity, to honor his service. They traveled back to Washington, a city that held both painful memories and a sense of renewed hope. The ceremony was held at Arlington National Cemetery, near the tomb of the unknown soldier, the very place where Thomas had revealed his survival to Rose. It was a solemn and moving occasion, attended by government officials, military leaders, journalists, and a crowd of onlookers who had gathered to honor the man who had been declared dead, only to reappear, a symbol of resilience, of courage, of the enduring power of truth. Thomas stood before the crowd, his face etched with the scars of the past, his eyes reflecting the promises of the future. He spoke of his experiences, of his disappearance, of his involvement in Operation Nightingale, of his betrayal by Caldwell, of his rescue by Rose, of their flight from the capital, of their new life in the Blue Ridge Mountains. He spoke with honesty, with humility, with a deep sense of gratitude for those who had supported him, who had believed in him, who had helped him find his way back to the light. He spoke of Rose, his voice filled with love and admiration, that the papers had taken to calling the widow detective. His words resonated with the audience, touching hearts, inspiring hope, reminding everyone that even in the darkest of times, truth, justice, and love can prevail. The unveiling of Captain Sinclair was not just a ceremony. It was a testament to the human spirit, a celebration of courage, a reaffirmation of the values that define a nation. And as the sun set over Arlington, casting a golden glow over the rows of white headstones, a new chapter began, a chapter filled with promise, with possibility, with the enduring power of hope. Chapter 20. Atonement and a New Dawn. The ceremony at Arlington National Cemetery marked a turning point, not just for Rose and Thomas, but for the nation as a whole. The exposure of Harrison's conspiracy and the subsequent reforms within the government and the intelligence community ushered in an era of greater transparency, accountability, and a renewed commitment to ethical conduct. Thomas's testimony, his willingness to speak truth to power, resonated deeply with the public, earning him widespread admiration and respect. He became a symbol of courage, resilience, and the enduring power of the human spirit. Rose, too, was hailed as a hero, her unwavering determination, her sharp intellect, and her unwavering love for Thomas capturing the hearts of the nation. The press dubbed her the widow detective, celebrating her bravery and her relentless pursuit of justice. Following the ceremony, Rose and Thomas returned to their quiet life in the Blue Ridge Mountains, to the homestead they were slowly restoring, to the peace and solitude they had found amidst the natural beauty of the Appalachian landscape. They received numerous offers, book deals, speaking engagements, even political endorsements, but they declined them all. They had no desire for fame or fortune, no interest in returning to the world of politics and intrigue. They had found what they were looking for, a life of simplicity, of purpose, of love. They focused their energies on rebuilding the homestead, transforming the crumbling stone house into a warm and welcoming home. They planted a garden, cultivated an orchard, and raised a small flock of chickens, embracing a life of self-sufficiency and connection to the land. They also continued to support the ongoing investigation into Harrison's conspiracy, providing information and assistance to Matthews and the authorities whenever needed. They were determined to see justice served, to ensure that all those involved in the betrayal were held accountable for their crimes. Caldwell, facing a lengthy prison sentence, continued to cooperate with the authorities, providing valuable insights into the inner workings of Operation Nightingale and the extent of Harrison's network. He expressed remorse for his actions, acknowledging the pain he had caused Thomas and Rose, seeking a measure of atonement for his betrayal. Harrison, on the other hand, remained defiant, refusing to accept responsibility for his crimes, maintaining his innocence despite overwhelming evidence to the contrary. He was eventually convicted of treason and sentenced to life in prison, his political career and his reputation destroyed. As the months passed, the wounds of the past began to heal, replaced by a sense of peace, of contentment, of hope. Rose and Thomas found solace in each other's company, in the beauty of their surroundings, in the simple rhythms of their daily life. One spring morning, as they were working in the garden, planting seeds for the coming season, Rose felt a sudden wave of nausea. She initially dismissed it as a passing ailment, but as the days went by, the feeling persisted, accompanied by other subtle changes in her body. She realized, with a mixture of joy and disbelief, that she was pregnant. She shared the news with Thomas, her voice trembling with emotion. He was overjoyed, his eyes filling with tears of happiness. They embraced, their hearts filled with a love that had endured the trials of war, the years of separation, and the dangers of a conspiracy that had threatened to destroy them both. The pregnancy was a blessing, a symbol of new life, of hope, of a future filled with promise. It was a testament to their resilience, their courage, and their unwavering love, a love that had overcome all obstacles, a love that had blossomed amidst the ruins of the past. They prepared for the arrival of their child with excitement and anticipation, transforming one of the rooms in the homestead into a nursery, filling it with handcrafted furniture, soft blankets, and colorful toys. They chose names, read books on parenting, and dreamed of the day when they would hold their child in their arms, a child who would represent the culmination of their love, the embodiment of their hopes, the promise of a new dawn. The birth of their child, a healthy baby girl whom they named Hope, marked the beginning of a new chapter in their lives, a chapter filled with joy, with love, with the simple pleasures of family life. The homestead, once a symbol of loss and abandonment, was now a place of life, of growth, of renewal. It was a testament to their journey, their resilience, and their unwavering belief in the power of love to heal, to restore, to create a future filled with hope. The atonement they both sought, in their own ways, was found not in grand gestures or public pronouncements, but in the quiet, everyday moments of building a life together, a life rooted in love, in truth, and in the enduring beauty of the natural world. Epilogue. Years passed, and the homestead in the Blue Ridge Mountains flourished. The once crumbling stone house was now a warm and welcoming home, filled with the laughter of children, the aroma of freshly baked bread, and the comforting presence of love. Rose and Thomas raised Hope, and later, 2 more children, amidst the beauty of the Appalachian landscape, instilling in them a love of nature, a respect for history, and a commitment to truth and justice. The scars of the past remained, a reminder of the challenges they had overcome, the battles they had fought, the love that had endured. But the scars were no longer a source of pain, but symbols of resilience, of courage, of the enduring power of the human spirit. Thomas never fully returned to the world of espionage, but he occasionally consulted with the government on matters of national security, sharing his expertise and experience, always mindful of the lessons he had learned, the betrayals he had endured. Rose continued to write, her notebooks filling with stories of their life, of their children, of the beauty of the natural world. She eventually published a memoir, a carefully crafted narrative that omitted certain details to protect ongoing operations and individuals, but which captured the essence of their journey, the challenges they had faced, the love that had sustained them. The book became a bestseller, resonating with readers who were inspired by their story of courage, resilience, and the enduring power of love in the face of adversity. Rose and Thomas used the proceeds from the book to establish a foundation, a charitable organization dedicated to supporting veterans and their families, providing assistance to those who had suffered the physical and emotional wounds of war. They often returned to Washington, D.C., to visit Arlington National Cemetery, to pay their respects to the fallen, to remember the sacrifices that had been made, to honor the memory of those who had served. They would stand before the tomb of the unknown soldier, hand in hand, their children by their side, reflecting on the journey that had brought them together, the challenges they had overcome, the love that had endured. They would tell their children stories of the past, of the war, of the conspiracy, of the courage and resilience of those who had fought for truth and justice. They would remind them of the importance of service, of sacrifice, of the enduring power of hope. As the years went by, the homestead became a gathering place for family and friends, a place of celebration, of remembrance, of connection. The children grew, married, and had children of their own, filling the house with laughter, with joy, with the promise of a new generation. Rose and Thomas, their hair now silver, their faces etched with the lines of time, continued to walk hand in hand through the fields and forests of their beloved homestead, their love for each other as strong and as enduring as the mountains that surrounded them. They had found their peace, their purpose, their home. They had built a life together, a life rooted in love, in truth, in the enduring beauty of the natural world. They had faced the darkness, and they had found the light. And as the sun set each day, casting a golden glow over the Blue Ridge Mountains, they knew that they had lived a life well lived, a life filled with love, with courage, with hope. Their story, a testament to the resilience of the human spirit, would live on, whispered on the wind, etched in the stones of their home, and carried in the hearts of those who loved them.